Well, it was I think I spent 4 years essentially with my time here in Mississippi, most of which was with North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, and I think it helped shape how I look at the law and how I have practiced law ever since. So it gave me a particular perspective and a set of interests that I think I've carried through with in my professional life since then. So, and I also made a lot of friends, and I've managed to stay in touch with some of them, and that's been important as well.
I imagine it was not only a trying time, but also exciting with what you all were doing and how important it was. Can you describe how you felt?
Oh, it was. I think for any of us who were in Mississippi or elsewhere in the South during that period of time and before it, it was a hugely exciting time and something that stayed with us. We were all quite young, and we were able to do things that we could never have done in any other environment. I was 2 years out of law school, and I was the executive director of a legal service program, which is, in retrospect, kind of ridiculous. But in terms of opportunities and in terms of what we could do and the kind of things we could do and accomplish, I think it was fantastically exciting and hard to duplicate. Very hard to duplicate for a lot of us, I think.
Was there a sense of team, a sense of we're all in this together, especially after it took off a little bit? How did it feel?
Well, particularly after we got out, after we left the law school and were sort of out there on our own. Yeah, we had quite a spirit of camaraderie. I think we were working very hard, and we were all under some threat, and so I think that brought us all together, and we socialized together. Our friends were people we socialized with, and so on, and we're all in the program one way or another, and we even had a softball team. We played one year. I think we entered a softball team in the Lafayette County League, and thought it was funny when we played the police or the sheriff's department or that sort of thing. It was always. I thought it was important, actually, for us to be out there and not be demonized the way some of us were, and I think just being out there and having a good time and doing what other people do and showing we like to have a good time, and we weren't all devils. I think that was important and part of that, and of course it helped with the teamwork as well. So yeah, there definitely was a sense of that.
Mm-hmm. What case, or I know you talked about several cases in the program a while back. Do you have any specific cases that you would say, well, this one touched me the most, or these two or so?
Yeah. One I was going to talk about, and it's in the written piece that I wrote that I guess they distributed or will be, that I didn't talk about this morning because I didn't feel I had the time, was, and it's important not so much because of the legal part of it, but the way it showed how we fit into and were part of a larger kind of struggle that was going on, is that right about the time we were opening our office in Holly Springs and we're getting to know and work with the some of the leadership of the community organization up there, there was an election, and for the first time there were black candidates running for various local offices. Skip Robinson ran for county sheriff, and Quintel Robinson ran for, I think, superintendent of education, and other people were running for supervisor and so on. And I don't think they won anything except some very small district-wide, didn't win any county-wide positions, but it was really a first major step in that county. And one of the issues that the African-American candidates were running on had to do with the fact that the Board of Supervisors had decided to discontinue the food stamp program. At that point in time, food stamps was optional on a countywide basis, and if you didn't have that, they had what was called the Commodities Distribution Program for poor people, which took old commodities and distributed them. But food stamps was much more popular because people could go to the regular stores and spend the food stamps and get regular food and so on. And so it was very, very desirable, and they were quite unhappy that the board had decided to discontinue the program. And so that became kind of a rallying cry for these candidates and within the community. And of course, I remember very well a meeting that took place at a church right after the election was over, maybe a few weeks after the election was over, and the organization was very energized and wanted to sort of think about where to go from there and what are we going to do next, sort of thing. And they were disappointed they had lost these elections, but they had registered a lot of voters. A lot of people had voted for the first time, and so there was a lot of good spirit. And we were at this meeting, and Skip Robinson, who was chairing the meeting, turned to me and said, "Well, what can we do about this food stamp thing next?" You know, and because that had been such an issue that had attracted support. And I looked at him and I said, "Well, tell everybody we're gonna have a petition, and we're gonna get it on the ballot. We're gonna petition to have a vote in this county on whether there should be a food stamp program." And he said, "That's great." And so he announced that we're gonna have a petition drive and everything else. And I had no idea, actually, whether in Mississippi you could have a petition drive like that at the time. But it seemed like a really good idea, and I always felt that was just giving that response was one of the best pieces of legal advice I ever gave a client, because it allowed them to continue to have an organizing effort around this issue that they were working on, and people felt so strongly about it they didn't have to just sort of go away and forget about it. They could keep doing it. And I went back and dug out the law books to make sure I hadn't misspoken, and made sure that we could do that. And then I drafted up some petitions that I thought complied with the local requirements, and they petitioned that. They got people to sign, and they got enough people to sign on these petitions. And of course, when they presented them, the Board of Supervisors rejected the whole thing and wouldn't do it anyway. And then we had to file suit at that point. And John Maxey was then the lawyer in Holly Springs. He had come by then in 1968, and he took over this case and filed a case. And ultimately, it went to the Mississippi Supreme Court, and they ruled that we were right, that they should have had a petition. They should have had a ballot, an election on this, and so on. By that time, I think the county had come around and was in the food stamp program anyway. But I use that example when I teach sometimes, and when I talk to groups about how the role that lawyers can play, and it's not just being able to go into court and to make your arguments and argue your case, but that part of being a lawyer in that kind of, in a movement really, is to support what's going on. And I really have always been proud of that very quick answer I gave off the top of my head, because it was, it allowed them to keep working and to keep building this organization. And it ultimately, they did elect candidates in the county and so on. And having this, you can't just build a movement, you have to have issues that people care about, and this allowed people to continue working about it. So that's always been one of my favorite situations and stories about the kind of things we were doing. I talked this morning about the Medicaid case, and I've always been quite proud of that one, because I think it had such a huge impact. It was really a pretty outrageous thing what the state did when they finally they were coming into the Medicaid program, probably the last state in the country to join into the program at all, and then to say, well, the way the Medicaid program was structured is that there were people that had to be covered, and then the state could go beyond that if they wanted. Well, the state, Mississippi, didn't go beyond that at all. So they restricted it to the people that the law said they had to do, but even there, they didn't do it for everybody, and they didn't want to provide medical care for the people who were called the caretaker relatives, which were the mothers and grandmothers and relatives who were taking care of the children who were on welfare. And so it was really a terrible, terrible policy. And we were able to ultimately get the court to say they had to cover these people, which I don't think they ever would have done, because I think the cost was so big, really. And as I said, I didn't know this at the time, but in reading recently, I saw a book where it turns out the state filed some papers in the case later on that said that 27,000 people had to be covered by the Medicaid program and got free medical care as a result of that lawsuit. And if you just average $100, if you just take an average of $100 a person for medical care in the course of a year, that's I can't do the math right now, but it's over $2 million a year in free medical care per year. So I always thought that was a great victory, and of course all the others that we worked on in different ways, but I think those have always been two that kind of stuck out in my mind.
When you worked on the Oxford desegregation case, were there many other schools in Mississippi that were already integrated?
Well, there was a real struggle. This was by 1968. This was 14 years after Brown versus Board of Education. But in Brown, the Supreme Court had said that schools should be integrated with all deliberate speed or something like that, and that was an invitation to school districts to really go very, very slow or to do nothing. And so there were various efforts by the school systems to avoid integrating in various ways. One was what they called freedom of choice, that parents had a choice as to where to send their kids. But given all the pressures in the community, if a black family decided to send their child to a formerly all-white school, there was enormous. They could lose their job. There could be threats. And of course, the kids would have been under tremendous pressure. So the freedom of choice approach really never worked. But it took quite a number of years of litigation to get the courts to really go beyond that and to say that if a freedom of choice plan wasn't working, then something else had to be done. Something had to be tried that was different, and you could have all the first grades in one school, and there were various ways you could accomplish it without essentially just keeping the schools the way they were and pretending that people were free to go to whichever school they wanted. And then they tried neighborhood schools. I mean, there were all kinds of different approaches that were intended to avoid desegregating the schools. And I think by the late 60s, 1968, thereabouts, there were very few school systems that were desegregated in any serious way as a result of this. And the ones that were the ones that where either the U.S. Department of Justice had brought a lawsuit to say you're not complying with Brown and you have to do certain things and get court orders to take steps beyond what they had done before. And then the NAACP Legal Defense Fund had brought some suits. So you had, I think there were roughly 160 school districts in the state at the time, and I don't remember what the numbers were, but I'm sure my guess is it was fewer than 50 were under court orders because there just weren't the resources to bring those groups were the only ones that were bringing these cases, and so we started, and I don't know whether we had 15 or 20, but those were districts where there was no desegregation, and I think it just continued. So my guess is that the districts where there was, the only place where there would have been any serious desegregation would have been where there had been lawsuits and then further enforcement of those orders so that they went back to court and got the courts to say, no, you're not doing enough, you've got to come up with a plan and that sort of thing. And they had to come up with different things that they could do to desegregate the school. Yeah.
When you were starting your project for legal services, and then when you were serving as director, did you ever feel that your life was in danger?
I don't think I ever. There were a few harrowing moments, I would say. Unlike John Britton, I was never arrested. I had people give me some pretty hard looks. I don't think there was ever a time. You read about and you see some of the films and so on from, say, the summer of so-called Freedom Summer of '64, when the 3 civil rights workers had been killed in Neshoba County, and I think that was a much more tense situation, and we were, and I don't think, even though it was, in retrospect, it was just a couple years beyond that, I don't think I ever felt really threatened, but there certainly were lots of looks and times when I was just a little nervous looking over my shoulder. I remember one situation which I've never understood what it was all about, but I had been at a meeting in Jackson, and I was driving back fairly late at night alone, and I used to come up the interstate and then I would go through Coffeyville, I think, down there, and drive up sort of one of the back roads to come here. I didn't go all the way to Batesville and over, but I would sort of cut over. It was a little shorter, and I got home at 1 o'clock in the morning, and there was a car in front of the house, which belonged to one of our other lawyers. And I went in, and my wife was there, and I said, and he was there, and I said, "What's going on? Why are you here?" And he said, "Well, there was a call to the house, and it was somebody from the sheriff's department. And they had said that I had been spotted driving through Coffeyville or someplace like that. And they never threatened me or anything, but it was just kind of never understood exactly what they were trying to accomplish, except to sort of say, we're watching him or something like that." And I said, "Well, thank you." And everybody was fine. Nothing else had happened. So we went to bed. And the next morning I went in. I decided that the thing to do was I went and saw the sheriff. I said, "Sheriff, this happened last night. I just thought you ought to know about it," something like that. And left, but it was just to kind of let him know that, A, it might have been some of his own people, and secondly, that we didn't care. So it was kind of like staring him down a little bit, and so that was the end of that. But to this day, I don't know what that was all about. I remember an incident where we had a friend visiting. He was an academic, and he was off, and he came down and wanted to spend a little time. And so he and I went, and it was an election, one of these Marshall County elections. I think it might have been the one I was talking about earlier. And he and I spent the day driving around to polling places and making sure that the black community was able to vote, and they were letting them vote, and there weren't any major incidents. I don't think there were any poll watchers there. I don't think there were federal poll watchers at those particular places. And so we just drove around, and then we spent the night involved in some of the counting of the ballots. And the way they did it then, at least, was they would put up a big billboard outside on the square, just right out on, and they'd have all the different races with the different candidates, and then they'd come in and they'd post, as the boxes came in and got counted, they would post the results. And so my friend and I were there, and we were sort of representing some of the black candidates and making sure that the votes were being counted properly and that sort of thing. So we were pretty visible, I think, in terms of people who were milling around, and they knew who we were and what we were doing. And finally, about quite late at night, we decided to drive back to Oxford, and I had an old VW that didn't have a gas gauge. It was an old Ford VW. Some people know about this. There was a thing on the floor, and when you got low, you just sort of flipped it onto it was sort of an extra tank of gas or something. And we had already done that, so we had no idea whether we were going to run out of gas or not. And here we were leaving town. We had a 25-mile ride or something from Holly Springs to Oxford. We didn't know if we were going to run out of gas. It was the middle of the night. There were lots of pickup trucks and people milling around, and everybody had seen us leave, and we were nervous. Now, nothing happened. We did, in fact, have enough gas to get back to Oxford, and we did get back okay, and nothing ever happened. So it wasn't so much but it's still, I haven't seen this individual a while, but he was, a few years ago, he was in Washington where I live. He was giving a talk, a seminar, and I went over to see him, and we talked about that incident, and we still remember that. So it was such. But I don't think that we were. The opposition we were feeling, I think, was largely political. I think. I don't think it was. I don't know, at least, that we were ever in real physical danger, although certainly something we thought about.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that you were in a different position because you were white versus any black lawyers who might be working similar? causes?
It's very hard to say. There was always this thing that, I mean, there are stories, I don't remember that ever happened to me, but there were stories about when integrated groups would go into a restaurant and they would say, well, we have to serve the blacks. We don't have to serve you. So there was that sort of feeling sometimes that they, in some ways, felt that the whites who were involved were more despicable in some ways because we had gone over to the other side, so to speak, and so I don't know that we were better off than or less risk than being arrested or whatever because we were white. It's hard to say. It's very hard to say. Yeah.
How do you think the civil rights movement today compares to that time? Any thoughts on those similarities?
Well, my legal practice over the years, since I've been in private practice, has involved representing lots of nonprofit organizations, many of whom are civil rights organizations and others. So I have some sense, and the issues have changed tremendously and are much more complicated and much more difficult to figure out solutions to. And I think in that way, and I think that the tactics are different. I think that there's a lot more lobbying and that sort of thing, trying to change policies around the country. But I don't know that. I don't think that the issues are the same. I mean, I think there is a lot of terrible things going on and things that definitely need to be corrected and so on around the country, and a number of people in jail and all kinds of things that are really remarkable. But I think it's a different, at least in my mind, it's a different situation than one existed even as late as the mid-1960s here and elsewhere. I mean, you had a real legal system that separated people for so long and separated them in terms of the customs and the way people were treated and the way language that was used and so on. I mean, at one point there was only one restaurant where integrated couples could go to. I mean, and not feel that was the Holiday Inn, I think that's a different sort of situation, and one that really was still going on at that point in time, and so I think the issues are different now.
When people find out your work in Mississippi, what do they say about Mississippi? How do you think that Mississippi is portrayed, now or recent past? Maybe outside of the area.
Well, it depends on who you're talking to and how much they know and how much history they know and so on. We have lots of our friends participated in different ways in different places, and so they know a lot more and so on, and some of them still have contacts and still work with people in Mississippi. So I think it's it varies so much with different people. I think that overall people still think the state is quite poor, which I think it is, and that has a tremendous impact on education and on job opportunities and all of the other kinds of things. And I think people understand that, and I think that would be the major view